Kneeling before the millionaire's triplets' grave, a poor girl cries in silence. But behind her tears lies a secret that could change everything. If you enjoy emotional stories, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're listening from. Continuing. Chapter 1. Encounters in Silence. The late afternoon sun painted the London sky in orange hues as Edward Mendoza walked through the gates of Highgate Cemetery. As on every Monday for the past 2 years, his body followed an automatic path while his mind wandered between memories and regrets. His firm steps, despite the invisible weight on his shoulders, betrayed the businessman he was on the outside, CEO of Mendoza Tech, one of the largest technology companies in the United Kingdom. At 47, Edward had achieved everything money could buy: an impeccable suit, a Swiss watch, an imported car waiting outside. But none of that mattered now. Here among tombstones and cypress trees, he was just a grieving father, walking towards his daughter's grave. "My girls," he murmured, approaching the white marble headstone where 3 names were engraved: Beatrice, Brianna, and Brooke Mendoza. 16 years old, 2007-2023, Edward knelt, placing 3 white roses, 1 for each daughter, identical triplets, except for the colored ribbons they had worn since they were little so everyone could tell them apart. Beatrice, the one with the red ribbon, the most determined. Brianna, with the blue ribbon, the dreamer. And Brooke, with the yellow ribbon, the peacemaker. "How slowly time passes without you," he whispered, arranging the flowers. "The company broke profit records this quarter. We've expanded into France and Germany." The words came out mechanically, like reports presented in board meetings. Edward did this every week, telling his daughters about his professional successes, as if somehow it could fill the void, justify that he was still living while they were not. "The board wants me to consider the proposal from Multi-Global, a merger that would triple our market value." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I can't concentrate in meetings. Everything seems so insignificant." The afternoon breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby oak tree. The cemetery was almost empty at this hour. That was why Edward always chose the same time. He didn't want an audience for his pain. He didn't want looks of pity or worse, curiosity. It wasn't every day you saw one of the country's most powerful men on his knees, talking to a stone. "It's been 2 years, 1 month and 17 days, he continued, running his fingers over the letters carved into the headstone. "And I still expect to hear you coming home, arguing about who gets to use the bathroom first." Edward closed his eyes, letting the memories flood in. The sound of teenage footsteps running through the house, synchronized laughter, arguments about boys, clothes, music, Brianna's ballet recitals, Beatrice's swimming competitions, Brooke's piano lessons, moments that would never return. But what truly devastated him wasn't just the memories of his daughters alive. It was the constant thought of what they wouldn't experience. There would be no graduation, university, first jobs, weddings, grandchildren, an entire future erased on a single rainy night, when the driver of the limousine taking them back from a party lost control on a bend of the M25 motorway. Edward opened his eyes, trying to push away the image of the wrecked car that still haunted his nightmares. That's when he heard it, a muffled sob coming from somewhere nearby. He straightened up, looking around. The sound seemed to be coming from behind a tree a few meters away. Moved by curiosity, Edward stood up and walked silently towards the noise. Skirting the wide trunk of the oak, he came across a scene that left him frozen. A small girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, was crouched on the other side of his daughter's headstone. She had brown skin, curly hair tied in a messy ponytail, and wore a simple, patterned cotton dress faded from many washes. In her arms, she held a worn-out stuffed rabbit, missing one eye. Her feet were clad in plastic sandals, the kind sold in corner shops. The girl didn't see him immediately. She continued whispering something to the grave, as if talking to someone who could hear her. Then, carefully, she took a small yellow flower from her dress pocket, probably picked along the path, and placed it on the headstone. "Who are you?" Edward finally asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The girl started, nearly falling backward. Her large eyes widened even more, filled with fear. For a moment, it looked like she was about to run. But then she composed herself and stood up, clutching the rabbit to her chest. "Sorry, mister, I just came to visit my friends," she answered, her voice thin and trembling. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. Friends? His daughters? Friends, he repeated, confused. The girl nodded, looking at the headstone. B, Bree, and Brooke, she said, as if the names were obvious. I come to talk to them almost every day after school. Edward felt his heart race. Those were the nicknames only very close people used for his daughters, and the 3 initial letters engraved on the headstone didn't reveal the full names to just any stranger. How did you know them? He asked, taking a step forward. The girl stepped back a little, cautious. At the park. They always played with me when my mum cleaned their auntie's house. Edward frowned. Auntie? His daughters didn't have any close aunts. His only sister had lived in Australia for years, and his ex-wife Christina was an only child. Which auntie? He asked, trying to soften his tone so as not to scare the child further. The pretty auntie who wore fancy clothes, the girl explained, as if it were obvious. My mum cleaned her house. Bea said she was their mum's sister. Even more confused, Christina had no sisters. Could the girl be making it all up? But how would she know the girls' nicknames? What's your name? He tried again, crouching down to be at the child's level. Julia, she replied, still hugging the stuffed rabbit. Then, as if remembering something important, she added, Bea, the one with the red ribbon, she saved me once. Edward's heart nearly stopped. What do you mean, saved you? Julia bit her lower lip, as if hesitant to continue. Her dark, expressive eyes seemed much older than her small body. I fell in the auntie's pool. I couldn't swim. Bea jumped in and pulled me out, she said, and then lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. She said she had to tell me something important about her dad, but the auntie came and got angry. Edward felt the world spin around him. Beatrice, his most athletic daughter, the club's junior swimming champion, saving this girl from drowning, a girl he had never seen before. When was this, Julia? A little while before they went to heaven, the girl replied with the cruel simplicity of children when speaking of death. A shout interrupted the conversation. Julia, Julia, where have you gotten to, girl? The female voice came from the main entrance of the cemetery. The girl looked in that direction, alarmed. It's Auntie Nora. I have to go, she said. And then, to Edward's surprise, she extended her small hand and touched his briefly. You're their dad, right? Bea talked about you a lot. Before Edward could answer, Julia was already running between the tombstones, the stuffed rabbit bouncing on her arm. He stood there, paralyzed, watching her disappear into the distance. It was only after a few minutes that Edward noticed something on the grass near where the girl had been crouching. He bent down to pick it up. It was a photograph. Even in the dim evening light, his heart immediately recognized his 3 daughters, smiling, wearing their traditional colored ribbons in their hair. They were in a park he didn't recognize, and next to them, the same girl, Julia, a little younger, hugging them, and behind the group, partially visible, was an elegant woman Edward had never seen. With trembling hands, he turned the photo over. On the back, written in unstable, childish handwriting, was a sentence that made his blood run cold. Daddy, this is my sister. Edward looked again at his daughter's grave, then at the photo in his hands. His head throbbed with 1,000 unanswered questions. How did his daughters know this girl? Why did they call her a sister? Who was the woman in the photo? And what did Beatrice want to tell him about himself? Tucking the photo into the inner pocket of his jacket, Edward took out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in a long time. Roger, it's Edward. I need your services again. It's urgent. On the other end of the line, the old private investigator who years ago had helped Edward uncover Christina's infidelities during their divorce sounded surprised by the call. I'm retired, Edward, came the hesitant reply. I'll double what you used to charge. It's about my daughters. There was a pause before the answer came. Meet me at the usual place in an hour. Edward hung up, looking one last time at his daughter's grave before walking quickly towards the exit. The sky was now almost completely dark, but for the first time in 2 years, he felt a different spark ignite in his chest. It wasn't just pain. It was something he had forgotten how to feel. It was purpose. The Regency Cafe was located in the old city centre, on a narrow street where time seemed to have stopped in the 1950s. Dark wooden tables, elderly waiters in bow ties, and a loyal clientele who preferred the authentic bitterness of a proper English brew to the gourmet versions of modern coffee shops. Edward arrived 20 minutes early. He sat at a table in the back, his back to the wall and facing the door, a habit acquired after he became a well-known name in business. He ordered a black coffee and waited, his mind still processing the unusual encounter at the cemetery. Roger Almeida entered punctually, as he always did. At 65, he maintained the upright posture and sharp gaze of someone who had spent his life observing people. He wore a well-cut but unostentatious grey suit and carried a worn leather briefcase that Edward knew well. 15 years of retirement and you're still as punctual as a Swiss watch, Edward commented as the other man sat down. Old habits, Roger replied with a half-smile, signaling to the waiter. The usual, John, he said, and the waiter nodded, moving away. The two men had known each other for over 20 years. Edward was still a rising entrepreneur when he first hired Roger to investigate a partner he suspected of embezzling funds. Since then, the investigator had become a sort of trusted resource for delicate situations, including the discovery of the infidelities of Christina, Edward's ex-wife, and the triplets' mother. You don't look well, Edward, Roger observed, studying his former client's face. And it's not just the grief, there's something new. Edward nodded, taking the photograph from his pocket and placing it on the table. I met a girl today at the cemetery. She was visiting my daughter's grave, said they were her friends. Roger took the photo, examining it carefully through the reading glasses he pulled from his jacket pocket. And this inscription on the back? I don't know. It looks like Beatrice's handwriting, my eldest daughter. Well, eldest by 4 minutes. The investigator turned the photo over a few times, analyzing the details. You don't recognize the woman in the background? Edward shook his head. Never seen her in my life. The girl said her mother worked for an aunt of my daughter's, but Christina doesn't have any sisters. Roger raised an eyebrow. Interesting. And does the girl have a name? Julia. She must be about 7 or 8 years old. She looked poor. Simple clothes, an old toy. She was with a woman she called Auntie Nora. The waiter returned, bringing a brandy for Roger. The old investigator thanked him with a nod and took a small sip before continuing. What exactly do you want me to find out? Edward leaned over the table, lowering his voice. Everything. Who this girl is, how she knew my daughters, why Beatrice called her a sister, who the woman in the photo is. He paused, his eyes hardening. And most importantly, she mentioned that Beatrice wanted to tell me something about me. Something important. It could just be a child's imagination, Roger pondered. She knew my daughter's nicknames. She knew which one wore the red ribbon. She said Beatrice saved her from drowning in this supposed auntie's pool. It's too specific. Roger took another sip of his brandy, thoughtful. I'll need the photo. I have a digital copy on my phone, Edward said, already taking the device out of his pocket. I just made it before I came. While Edward sent the image to Roger's email, the investigator opened his briefcase and took out an old notepad. Any other information that might help? Details about the woman who picked up the girl at the cemetery? Clothes, accent, anything? Edward tried to remember. I didn't see her. I only heard her voice calling for Julia. Name of Nora or something like that? And the girl? Physical characteristics? Clothes, manner of speaking? Light brown skin, dark curly hair, big brown eyes, a simple patterned cotton dress. Plastic sandals, an old stuffed rabbit missing one eye. She spoke like someone from a simple background, but articulate for her age. Roger jotted everything down quickly, his slanted handwriting filling the page. What else did the girl say about your daughters? Edward felt a lump in his throat, that she visited their grave almost every day after school, that they were her friends, that this happened a little while before they went to heaven. Roger's expression softened for a moment. I'm sorry to reopen these wounds, Edward. They never closed, Edward replied, looking through the cafe window at the night that had already fallen outside. But for the first time in 2 years, I feel like there might be something I don't know. Something that could... He didn't complete the sentence. He didn't want to say out loud that he had a sudden hope that perhaps his daughter's death wasn't the accident everyone believed it to be. That would be madness. It would be opening a door to an even deeper kind of pain. Roger seemed to understand the unsaid. He closed his notepad and put away his pen. I'll start immediately. With the photo, I can use facial recognition to try and identify the woman in the background. As for the girl with the first name and description, I might be able to track school records in the area near the cemetery. Money is no object, Edward assured him. It never was, Roger replied with a discreet smile, finishing his brandy. But it's good to remember that sometimes what we discover isn't what we want to hear. Edward nodded gravely. I just want the truth, whatever it is. As Roger stood up to leave, Edward stopped him with one final question. "How long do you think it will take?" The investigator considered for a moment. "If the girl really frequents the cemetery regularly, I might have some answers in a few days. For the full picture, a week, maybe 2. "Keep me informed daily," Edward requested, extending his hand. Roger shook it firmly. Like old times, when the investigator left the cafe, Edward remained seated, staring at his untouched, now cold cup of coffee. He took the photograph out of his pocket again and studied his daughter's faces. The identical smiles, the bright eyes full of life, and next to them, an unknown girl they called Sister. For the first time since the accident, Edward felt that maybe fate was offering him, if not answers, at least a new purpose, to discover the truth about his daughters, even if that truth brought more pain than relief. He paid the bill and stepped out into the London night, the illuminated city contrasting with the darkness that dwelled within him. On the way to his car, his phone rang. It was Roger. "Got something already?" Edward answered, surprised by the speed. "Just an interesting coincidence. 4 years ago, a woman named Helen Souza, 32, died of sudden cardiac arrest. She was a domestic helper, left behind a 3-year-old daughter named Julia, who went to live with her maternal aunt Nora Souza." Edward felt a chill. "And how does that connect to us?" "Helen worked for 5 years as a personal assistant to a woman named Diana Alves." Edward stopped walking, leaning against a nearby wall. "Diana Alves, Christina's sister." "No," Roger replied, and Edward could hear the sound of keys being typed on the other end of the line. But interestingly, Diana Alves was married to Victor Alves, who briefly worked at Mendoza Tech about 10 years ago. And even more interesting, Diana Alves died in a fire at her beach house in Cornwall 8 months ago. Edward tried to process the information. He didn't remember any Victor Alves, but his company had had hundreds of employees over the years. "Keep digging," he said finally. "Tomorrow, I'll be at the cemetery at the same time. Maybe the girl will show up again." "Be careful," Roger warned. "If there's more to this story than meets the eye, we don't know who else might be watching." Edward hung up and got into his car. In the rearview mirror, he observed his own face, noticing how much he had aged in the last 2 years. The deeper wrinkles, the grey hair at his temples, the eyes that had lost their shine. "What were you trying to tell me, my girls?" he murmured, starting the engine. On the passenger seat, the photograph with 3 identical smiles seemed to hold secrets that were only just beginning to unravel. And the night, a silent accomplice, held the answers that Edward Mendoza was just beginning to seek. Chapter 2. Secrets Unearthed. Edward's mansion in Hampstead remained silent like an empty cathedral. Since his daughter's death, he had dismissed almost all the staff. He couldn't bear to hear footsteps in the corridors that weren't theirs. Now, only Mrs. Elmira, the housekeeper who had looked after the house for over 20 years, and Anthony, the driver and security guard, remained. It was enough for a man who lived more in his office than at home. That morning, Edward woke up before his alarm, after a night of confusing dreams where his daughters ran through a labyrinth, always just out of his reach, calling for a sister he didn't know. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face with his hands. The digital clock read 5:47 a.m. He got up and walked to the closet, where an entire wall was covered with photographs of the triplets at different stages of their lives. From birth to adolescence, every milestone was there: the first day of school, birthdays, trips, sports competitions, school performances. A mosaic of memories frozen in time. "What else don't I know about you?" he murmured, touching a photo where the 3 of them, around 14 years old, posed smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower during a family trip. His phone vibrated on the bedside table. It was a message from Roger. Accessed social services records. Julia Souza, 7 years old, orphan, under the guardianship of maternal aunt Nora Souza, 48, domestic worker. They live in Peckham. The girl attends St. Giles Primary School. And there's more. Found an incident report from 2 years ago. A possible drowning averted in a private pool. The child was Julia. Edward felt his heart speed up. The girl's story was confirmed. His daughters really did know her. The rescue at the pool had happened. He went down to the kitchen where Mrs. Elmira was already making coffee, as she did every day, religiously at 6 a.m. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she greeted, surprised to see him awake so early. "Didn't you sleep well?" "Not really, Elmira," he replied, pouring himself some coffee. "Do you remember if my daughters ever mentioned a friend named Julia? A younger girl, perhaps from a humble family. The housekeeper frowned thoughtfully. The girls had so many friends, sir. But let me see. She stopped stirring the pot of porridge, looking at the ceiling as if she could find the answer there. There was a little one they mentioned a few times. I found it strange at the time because she didn't seem to be from their social circle. I remember Brianna saying they needed to buy a present for this girl. A toy, I think. A stuffed rabbit? Edward ventured. Mrs. Elmira's eyes lit up. That's right, a little caramel-colored rabbit. Beatrice insisted it had to have a red ribbon just like hers. She smiled at the memory. They were so generous, your girls. Edward felt a lump in his throat. Did they mention how they met this girl? Mrs. Elmira served the porridge in a bowl and placed it in front of Edward, with a maternal gesture she had been making since he was a young, single entrepreneur. I think they said something about the girl's mother working for Mrs. Christina, or was it for a friend of hers? I'm not sure, she shrugged. You know how teenage talk is, sir, in one ear and out the other. Edward ate automatically, his mind processing the information. Christina had kept a separate home even during their marriage. To maintain my independence, she used to say. Even after the triplets were born, she had insisted on keeping her flat in Kensington, where she spent several days a week, supposedly managing her interior design projects. At the time, Edward was too busy building his tech empire to question his wife's arrangements. And later, when he discovered her affairs, it was too late. The girls had been born, and he didn't want to disrupt their lives with a messy divorce. He preferred to wait until they turned 12 to finally separate from Christina. Mr. Edward? Mrs. Elmira's voice brought him back to the present. Is everything all right? You've barely touched your coffee. Just thinking, Elmira, he replied, forcing a smile. Tell Anthony I won't need him today. I'll drive myself. Half an hour later, Edward was sitting in his car in front of a small office in the Holborn district. The discreet sign read simply, Nash Legal. It was 7:15 a.m., too early for visits, but Edward knew that Charles Nash, like him, was a chronic early riser. He wasn't wrong. When he rang the bell, the door was opened by Charles himself, a man in his early 60s with perfectly trimmed white hair and sharp eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. Edward, the lawyer seemed surprised. Has something happened? I need to check some documents from my divorce, Edward replied, entering the office without waiting for an invitation. And some others from Christina's will. Charles closed the door, adjusting the tie on the dress shirt he was already wearing, despite the hour. You know it's my duty as a lawyer to maintain confidentiality about... Charles, Edward interrupted, turning to face him, I've known you for 20 years. I was your first major client when you opened this firm. I need answers, and you're the only one who can help me. The lawyer sighed, indicating a chair for Edward to sit in. What exactly are you looking for? I want to know if Christina had any property I didn't know about, specifically a house with a pool, where she might have occasionally taken our daughters. Perhaps during those quality weekends she was so insistent on having a loan with them. Charles took off his glasses and cleaned the lenses with a handkerchief, a gesture Edward knew well. It was what he did when he needed to buy time to organize his thoughts. During the probate after Christina and the girls' deaths, we catalogued all the assets, he said carefully. The flat in Kensington, which went to the foundation you created in their name, the beach house in Brighton, which was sold as per your instructions, and the shares in the design company, which also went to the foundation. And what if she had something in someone else's name? A friend, perhaps, or... Edward hesitated. A sister? The lawyer frowned. Christina didn't have any siblings, Edward. You know that. What if she did, Charles? A half-sister, maybe? Someone she never mentioned? Charles opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder labeled with Edward's name. Let me check some documents, he said, leafing through papers. When Christina hired my services for the divorce, I had to do a complete investigation into her family background for inheritance matters. He stopped at a specific page. Here, Christina Almeida Campos, born on May 17, 1979, in London. Daughter of Augusto Campos and Maria Helena Almeida, both deceased, no documented siblings. Edward slammed his hand on the table in frustration. What if she had a sister on her father's side, or even a close cousin she treated like a sister? Charles closed the folder, looking seriously at Edward. What's going on, Edward? Why these questions now, after all this time? Edward hesitated, but decided he needed allies. He took the photograph from his pocket and handed it to Charles. I found a girl yesterday at the cemetery. She knew my daughters, said they were her friends, and this photo," he pointed to the inscription on the back, "seems to suggest they considered her a sister." Charles studied the photograph, his expression growing more concerned. "And this woman in the background?" "I have no idea. But my investigator found out that a woman named Helen Souza, who was this girl Julia's mother, worked as a personal assistant for a Diana Alves, who in turn was married to a man who briefly worked at Mendoza Tech." The lawyer looked up quickly. "Diana Alves, are you sure of that name?" Charles's tone made Edward lean forward. "Yes, why? Do you know her?" Charles stood up and walked to a metal filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened a drawer, shuffled through some folders, and pulled out a thin document. During the divorce proceedings, there was a suspicious transfer from Christina's account, a considerable sum, £200,000, to a woman named Diana Alves. At the time, Christina claimed it was an investment in a design business. You didn't want to contest it because you were focused on the custody of the girls. Edward took the document, examining it. There it was, a bank transfer from Christina to Diana Alves, dated April 2013, about 3 months before the divorce was finalized. "Why didn't you tell me about this at the time?" Charles shrugged. "I did, Edward. You said 200,000 was pocket change compared to what you wanted. Custody of the triplets. Your exact words were, 'Let her keep the money, I'll keep my daughters.'" Edward remembered now. Those months had been a blur of anger, betrayal, and determination. To protect the girls from the scandals that could arise if he pushed Christina too hard. "Do you have an address for this, Diana?" Charles shook his head. "Not on the document, just the bank details." Edward put the photograph back in his pocket. "Thank you, Charles. This helps." "Edward," the lawyer called as he was heading for the door, "be careful. Digging up the past sometimes brings things to the surface we'd rather not know." Edward nodded and stepped out into the brightening London morning. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Roger. "Important discovery. Diana Alves wasn't just an acquaintance of Christina's. According to DNA records found in a filed paternity case, they were half-sisters on their father's side. Augusto Campos had an extramarital affair that resulted in Diana's birth 3 years after Christina. The case was settled with a confidential agreement when Diana was 18. Edward stopped in the middle of the pavement, rereading the message twice to be sure. Christina had a half-sister she never mentioned, with whom she apparently kept in touch, and to whom she transferred a considerable sum of money just before the divorce. He quickly typed a reply. "Where did Diana live before the fire?" The answer came almost instantly. She had a house in Surrey and a flat in Mayfair. The beach house in Cornwall was where the fire that supposedly killed her occurred. "I'm checking for any inconsistencies in the forensic report." Edward got into his car and sat, trying to organize his thoughts. The connections were starting to form. Christina had a secret half-sister, Diana. Diana employed Julia's mother, Helen. Somehow his daughters met Julia and considered her a sister. And then all the adults involved in this story were dead. Christina and the triplets in the car crash, Helen from a sudden heart attack, and Diana in a fire. Too much of a coincidence for his taste. His phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Edward Mendoza." "Mr. Mendoza." A female voice, anxious. "My name is Nora Souza. I'm Julia's aunt. She told me she spoke with you yesterday at the cemetery." Edward felt his pulse quicken. "Yes, we spoke briefly." "Please," the woman's voice sounded shaky. "I need to talk to you. It's important. About your daughters and my niece." "I'm listening." "Not on the phone, it's not safe." She paused. "Can you meet us today?" Edward hesitated for only a second. "Where and when?" "At the little park in front of St. Giles Primary School in Peckham, at 4 in the afternoon when Julia gets out of school. Please come alone." "I'll be there," Edward assured her. "But first, tell me, how did you get my number?" There was a brief silence before the reply. "Helen, Julia's mother, left a sealed envelope with me. She said if anything happened to her, I should contact you. Your number was in there, along with other things you need to see." The call ended before Edward could ask any more questions. He stared at the phone for a few moments, trying to process what he had just heard. An envelope left by Helen, Julia's deceased mother, with his phone number and instructions to contact him in the event of her death. This changed everything. Edward sent a quick message to Roger, informing him of the phone call and the scheduled meeting. The reply came in seconds. "Don't go alone, it could be a trap." Edward considered the possibility, but his gut told him that Nora Souza was genuinely scared, and if she had information about his daughters, he had to take the risk. "I'll be fine," he replied. "Just be on standby. I'll send you my live location." The rest of the morning dragged on as Edward tried to focus on work. 2 important meetings with foreign investors, a video conference with the development team, and a pile of documents to sign. But his mind was miles away, lost in a labyrinth of family secrets and mysterious deaths. At 2 in the afternoon, he could no longer feign interest in company matters. He told his assistant he had a personal emergency and left, driving aimlessly through the congested London streets, trying to organize the facts. Christina, his ex-wife, had a secret half-sister named Diana. Diana employed Helen, Julia's mother. His daughters knew Julia and considered her a sister. Helen died of a heart attack 4 years ago. Christina and the triplets died in the accident 2 years ago. Diana died in a fire 8 months ago. Helen left an envelope for Edward in case something happened to her. How many coincidences did it take to form a pattern? At 3:30 p.m., Edward parked his imported car a few blocks from the school in Peckham. He didn't want to draw unnecessary attention in the working-class neighborhood. He walked to the designated park and sat on a bench, watching the activity. The school was a simple 2-story building, painted light blue with a small fenced-in playground. Children were starting to gather at the gate, waiting for the dismissal bell. At 4 p.m. sharp, the gate opened, and a crowd of uniformed children spilled out onto the street. Edward stood up, searching for Julia among them. A few minutes later, he saw the girl leaving, holding hands with a middle-aged black woman with graying hair tied in a bun, wearing a simple skirt and a cotton blouse. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle them. "Mrs. Souza." "Nora Souza?" The woman turned quickly, her eyes wide with apprehension. When she saw Edward, she seemed simultaneously relieved and even more nervous. "Mr. Mendoza," she said in a low voice. "Thank you for coming." Julia beside her widened her eyes in recognition of Edward. "It's Bree, and Brooke's dad," the girl exclaimed. Nora placed a finger on her lips, a gesture for her niece to speak more quietly. "We can't talk here," she said to Edward. "There's a cafe 2 blocks from here. Can we go there?" Edward nodded, following them. He watched as Julia skipped along, seemingly oblivious to the adult's tension. She carried the same worn-out school backpack and the stuffed rabbit, which seemed to never leave her arms. The cafe was a modest establishment, frequented mainly by local workers. Nora chose a table in the back, away from the windows. She ordered a coffee for herself and a hot chocolate for Julia, while Edward requested only a glass of water. "Julia, my love," Nora said after the drinks arrived, "why don't you go play in the kids' corner for a little bit? Auntie needs to talk to the gentleman." The girl looked at Edward, hesitant. "Are you going to bring Bree and Brooke back?" she asked with the painful innocence of children. Edward felt his heart clench. "No, sweetie. They're in heaven, remember? They can't come back." Julia looked down, sad. "I know. But Bee told me that even when people go to heaven, they can help the people who are still here." She hugged the stuffed rabbit tighter. "That's what she told me when my mum died." Nora stroked her niece's hair. "Go play for a bit. Go on. We'll talk more later, okay?" When Julia reluctantly moved to the small children's area in the corner of the cafe, Nora turned to Edward, her face serious. "First of all, Mr. Mendoza, I need to know, are you investigating my sister's death?" The question caught Edward by surprise. "Actually, I'm investigating what happened to my daughters, but it seems the stories are connected somehow." Nora nodded, as if confirming something she already suspected. "Helen, my sister, worked as Diana Alves's personal assistant. She did everything, took care of the house, the clothes, the schedule, even more private matters." She lowered her voice. "Helen was a single mother. Julia's father disappeared before she was even born. Diana offered a good salary, a room in her house for them to live in, a good school for Julia. It was an opportunity my sister couldn't refuse." "And how did my daughters get into this story?" Edward asked. "Diana was your ex-wife's sister," Nora replied, watching him closely for his reaction. "I've already figured that out. Half-sisters, to be precise." Nora seemed surprised that he already knew. Yes, but very few people knew about that connection. They kept it a secret. Diana lived as if she were just a close friend of Christina's. Sometimes your daughters would go to Diana's house on the weekends. That's how they met Julia. Edward took a sip of water, trying to remain calm. And their friendship? A faint smile crossed Nora's tired face. The girls adored Julia. Even though they were much older, they were patient with her. They taught her things, brought her presents. Especially Beatrice, the one with the red ribbon. She and Julia had a special connection. Julia mentioned that Beatrice saved her from drowning. Nora's face darkened. That was a little over 2 years ago. Diana was having a pool party. Julia couldn't swim well, but she loved the water. No one noticed when she slipped and fell into the deep end. Beatrice was the only one who saw and jumped in to save her. And after that... Nora hesitated, glancing at Julia in the play area, as if to make sure she couldn't hear them. After that, things got strange. Helen started acting differently, nervous, scared. Sometimes I'd find her crying. When I asked what was wrong, she'd say she was involved in something dangerous, but she couldn't get out. What kind of dangerous thing? Edward pressed. She never went into detail, just said that Diana and Christina were doing wrong things, that she'd found out by accident, and that now she knew too much. Nora swallowed hard. 2 weeks after that conversation, Helen died. Cardiac arrest, they said. A 32-year-old woman with no history of heart problems. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. Do you think she was murdered? Nora completed, her voice almost a whisper. I have no proof. But the day before she died, Helen came to my house. She was terrified, said she needed to give me something to keep safe. She opened her purse and took out a brown envelope worn at the edges. This, she said, if anything happened to her, I should give it to you, and only you. But I didn't know who you were until Julia mentioned meeting you at the cemetery. Edward took the envelope with trembling hands. Have you looked inside? Nora shook her head. It's sealed, just as she left it. She said it was too dangerous to open. Edward turned the envelope over. There was a red wax seal with what looked like a stylized initial, an elaborate H. Why did she want you to give this to me specifically? I don't know, Nora answered honestly. But Helen said something strange that last day. She said, he has the right to know the truth about his family, before it's too late for the girls too. Edward felt the blood freeze in his veins. And 2 weeks after her death, your daughters and your ex-wife had the accident, Nora finished, tears in her eyes. I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Mendoza, and ever since then, I've lived in fear. Fear that one day they'll come for Julia too. She's the only living witness to whatever happened in that house. Edward looked at the little girl, who was playing happily with other children, unaware of the grim conversation taking place just a few feet away. Do you have somewhere safe to go? Relatives in another city, perhaps? Nora shook her head. I'm a cleaner, Mr. Mendoza. I can barely afford the rent for our little room. And I'm afraid to run. What if they find us anyway? At least here I know the neighbors, the people in the community. There's some protection in that. Edward took his phone out of his pocket and typed a quick message to Roger. Need security for 2 people immediately. Discreet but effective. Putting the phone away, he looked at Nora again. I will ensure that you are protected, and I will find out what's in this envelope. If it's what I suspect, there may be enough evidence to bring whoever did this to our families to justice. Nora looked relieved, but still apprehensive. There's one more thing you need to know, she said, leaning even closer. Something Julia told me recently, but that I didn't understand at the time. She said that on the day Beatrice saved her from the pool, she heard your daughter arguing with Diana and Christina. She said Beatrice shouted, "He has the right to know she's his daughter too." Edward felt as if the world had stopped spinning. His daughter? Which daughter? Julia. Are you saying that? I'm not saying anything, Nora interrupted. I'm just repeating what a 7-year-old child told me. It might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. Edward looked at Julia again, studying her features more closely. The shape of her eyes, her smile, the way she tilted her head when concentrating on something. There was something vaguely familiar, but it could just be his imagination working under the influence of Nora's suggestion. I appreciate your honesty, he said finally, and your courage in contacting me. Nora gave a small, sad smile. It's not courage, Mr. Mendoza. It's desperation. I have nowhere left to run. At that moment, Edward's phone rang. It was Roger. I'm on the corner by the cafe. the investigator said without preamble. There's a black car that's been parked across the street for 20 minutes. 2 men inside watching the entrance. I don't like it. Edward stood up immediately. We have to get out of here, now. Nora noticed the urgency in his voice and called Julia. What's the problem? She asked, already grabbing her purse. It might be nothing, but we're not taking any chances. Edward looked around, searching for an alternative exit. He saw a door in the back, probably leading to the kitchen. Let's go this way. He took a few notes from his wallet, left them on the table, and led Nora and Julia towards the back. The waitress tried to protest as they passed through the kitchen door, but Edward muttered something about a family emergency and kept walking. They exited through a service door into a narrow alley filled with bins and empty boxes. Edward typed another quick message to Roger, informing him of their escape route. There's a car waiting for me on the next street, Roger said over the phone when Edward called. Grey license plate ends in 3387. I'll distract the suspects. Be careful, Edward urged, guiding Nora and Julia through the labyrinth of Peckham's alleys. I always am, Roger replied before hanging up. Julia looked at Edward with wide eyes, a mix of fear and excitement. Are we running from the bad men? She asked, out of breath. Edward exchanged a look with Nora before answering. It's just a precaution, sweetie. Like a game, you see. We have to get to my friend's car without anyone seeing us. The girl nodded solemnly, clutching the stuffed rabbit to her chest. Mr. Rabbit and I are good at hiding, she whispered. We used to play hide-and-seek with Bee, Bree, and Brooke. They always found me because I laughed too much. Despite the tension, Edward felt a pang of tenderness. This child had been loved by his daughters. That, more than any DNA test or shocking revelation, meant something profound to him. They reached the parallel street, where a grey sedan was waiting for them, engine running. Edward opened the back door, helping Nora and Julia get in, before settling into the passenger seat. At the wheel was a woman of about 40, with short hair and watchful eyes. Marcia, she introduced herself briefly. Roger asked me to take you to a safe place. Thank you, Edward replied, still checking the rearview mirror to make sure they weren't being followed. Where are we going? I have a flat in the name of a shell company. Completely anonymous. You'll stay there until Roger ensures it's safe to move. As the car sped away from Peckham, Edward looked at the envelope in his hands. So many secrets, so many deaths, and at the center of it all, a question he barely dared to fully form in his mind. Was it possible that Julia was more than his daughter's friend? Was she really their sister, as the photo suggested? And if she was, who was the father? In the back seat, Julia fell asleep, exhausted by the adrenaline of the escape. Her head rested in Nora's lap, who stroked her hair tenderly. The envelope weighed in Edward's hand as if it were made of lead, not paper. Whatever truth it contained, one thing was certain: nothing would be the same after he discovered it. Chapter 3. Painful Truths. The flat was on the 17th floor of a commercial building in Canary Wharf. No name on the door, just a number, 1705. The space was impersonal but comfortable, a living room with a sofa bed, a kitchenette, one bedroom, and a bathroom. The windows offered a panoramic view of the city, which was beginning to light up at twilight. Marcia showed them the security system: 2 locks, an intercom with a camera, and an alarm connected to a private firm. Don't use your personal phones, she instructed, handing Edward 2 new devices, still in their boxes. These are secure. Only 3 numbers are programmed: mine, Roger's, and the security company's. Roger will be here shortly. Julia explored the flat with childlike curiosity, opening cupboards, testing the TV remote, and experimentally jumping on the sofa when she thought no one was looking. How long do we need to stay here? Nora asked, watching her niece. Until we're sure you're not being followed, Marcia replied. There's food in the fridge and basic clothes in the wardrobes. Edward stared out the window, watching the city transform into a sea of lights. Somewhere down there, someone could be looking for them. Someone who had already taken so many lives. How did they find us at the cafe? He asked Marcia. The woman crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. 2 men in the car, as Roger said. A third one came in after you. Executive type, expensive suit. He stood at the counter pretending to read the paper, but he was clearly watching you. She paused. We sent photos for facial recognition analysis. Roger will bring the results. When Marcia left, promising to return in the morning with supplies, Edward finally sat on the sofa. The envelope was still in his hands, intact. Part of him wanted to rip it open immediately, to uncover all the truths it held. Another part feared what he would find. The doorbell interrupted his thoughts. It was Roger. As soon as he entered the flat, the investigator got straight to the point. "We've identified one of the men from the car, Victor Alves, a real estate developer. And guess what? Ex-husband of Diana Alves, the supposedly deceased half-sister of your ex-wife." Edward felt his stomach sink. Supposedly? Roger placed his briefcase on the sofa and took out some documents. "I've been checking the reports from the fire that supposedly killed Diana 8 months ago. The body was burned beyond recognition. Identification was made only by personal effects and location, but there was no DNA test. Are you suggesting she might be alive?" "I'm suggesting that nothing in this story is what it seems." Roger looked meaningfully at the envelope in Edward's hand. "Is that what Helen left for you?" Edward nodded, showing him the intact seal. "Let's open it at once," he decided. "We need to know what we're dealing with." Carefully, Edward broke the wax seal and opened the envelope. Inside were several documents, a handwritten letter, and a USB stick. He picked up the letter first. The handwriting was small and rushed, as if written by someone in a hurry or in fear. "Mr. Mendoza, my name is Helen Souza. If you are reading this, it's because I am no longer alive to tell you personally what I discovered. I worked for 6 years as a personal assistant to Diana Alves, the half-sister of your ex-wife Christina. During that time, I witnessed and, unfortunately, assisted in activities that I now know to be criminal. Diana and Christina, along with Diana's husband Victor, are involved in a money laundering scheme using Mendoza tech as a front. Victor briefly worked at your company years ago, long enough to create ghost access to the financial systems. They have been embezzling millions over the years. But there is an even bigger secret you need to know, as painful as it may be. Diana is not just Christina's half-sister. She had an affair with you about 8 years ago during a tech conference in New York, when you and Christina were temporarily separated. You might remember her as Daniela, the name she used on that occasion. From that brief encounter, my Julia was born. Yes, Mr. Mendoza, Julia is your biological daughter. When Diana discovered the pregnancy, Christina had already returned to you. Diana was desperate, newly divorced from Victor and in financial trouble. Christina offered her money to hide the child and never reveal the truth. That's when I came into the picture. Diana offered me a deal. I would raise the child as my own, in exchange for absolute silence. I accepted because I had just lost my own baby in a miscarriage and was devastated. Julia was my salvation. I have loved her as my true daughter from the very first moment. Everything changed when your daughters accidentally found out about Julia. The girls were fascinated by her. Beatrice especially developed an immediate connection. On the day of the drowning, Beatrice confronted Diana and Christina. I overheard part of the conversation. Beatrice shouted that Julia was their half-sister, that you were the father, and that you had the right to know. 2 weeks later, I discovered plans for an accident that would silence the girls. I tried to warn Christina, thinking she would at least protect her own daughters, but she was as involved as Diana. On the USB stick, you will find all the proof, financial documents, incriminating emails, recorded conversations, and most importantly, a recording where Diana and Victor discuss the details of the accident that killed your daughters and Christina, who was not in the car that day. As everyone thinks, I confronted Diana, who admitted to the conspiracy. The passenger was one of their employees, physically similar to Christina, with fake documents. Christina and Diana are alive, in hiding, probably preparing to disappear with the money they have accumulated all these years. Seek the truth. Protect Julia. She is all that is left of your bloodline now. Helen Souza. Edward let the letter fall to the floor, his whole body trembling. Nora, who had been reading over his shoulder, had tears streaming down her face. Helen, my sister. Keeping this secret all this time. Roger was already checking the other documents from the envelope. The DNA test is here, he said in a low voice. It confirms everything. Edward couldn't process it. Julia, his daughter, his triplets, murdered because they discovered the truth. Christina, alive, a conspirator in the murder of her own children. Uncle! The small voice pulled him from his thoughts. Julia was standing beside him, looking at him with those enormous brown eyes he now realized were strangely similar to his own. Are you sad? She asked, holding out her stuffed rabbit. Mr. Rabbit helps when I'm sad. You can borrow him for a little bit." Edward felt something break inside him. He knelt to her level and, without thinking, pulled her into a hug. Julia, after a moment of surprise, hugged him back, her small arms circling his neck. "Thank you," he whispered. "But I think Mr. Rabbit needs to stay with you." When he pulled away, he saw Julia studying him intently, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You look like the photo my mummy kept," she said suddenly, "the one she looked at when she thought I was asleep." Edward exchanged a look with Nora, who quickly suggested that Julia take a bath before dinner. When the two disappeared into the bathroom, Edward turned back to Roger. "I want to check the USB stick, now." Roger inserted the device into his laptop. A folder appeared, containing several meticulously organized files. Edward pointed to a folder titled Accident. Inside was an audio file marked finalplanning.mp3. Roger clicked on it, and the voices filled the room. "Are you sure the driver is bought?" A female voice, cold and calculating. "Absolutely. He got half up front. He'll get the rest when the job is done. He knows it has to look like an accident." A male voice. "And what about Christina? She can't be in the car, obviously. We've already sorted that. Anna looks similar enough. With the right hair and Christina's ID, no one will question it." The girls. A third voice, which Edward immediately recognized as Christina's. "Unfortunately, they are necessary collateral damage. Beatrice knows too much, and the other two won't stay quiet. They're too close. It's all of them or none." The first female voice, which Edward now understood to be Diana's. "My God, we're talking about my daughters," Christina, sounding disturbed. "Daughters you're willing to sacrifice for our plan. Don't have a crisis of conscience now, Christina. It's too late. If Edward finds out about the embezzlement, we all go down. If he finds out about Julia, you lose everything in the divorce: custody, alimony, social status." The audio continued, revealing more details of the macabre plan, including the elimination of Helen with a sudden heart problem and the certainty that Edward would be too busy grieving to notice the money disappearing. When it finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Edward felt nauseous, his throat tight. "My God," he finally managed to say. "There's more," Roger said, already examining other files. "Documents showing transfers of over £300 million to offshore accounts. A complete escape plan." "I need to go to the police." Edward stood up. "Not yet," Roger stopped him. "We need to organize everything, ensure the evidence is irrefutable, and more importantly, we need to protect Julia." The mention of the girl made Edward look towards the hallway. His daughter, his only remaining daughter, a child he never knew, who had been kept from him by a cruel scheme. "How long until we have a solid case?" he asked, trying to focus. "A day or two at most. I have contacts in the National Crime Agency, people I trust." Edward nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, everyone stays here. Safe." Nora returned to the room, reporting that Julia had finally fallen asleep after her bath and a snack. Edward quietly opened the bedroom door to see her. The dim light from the hallway illuminated her small face, relaxed in sleep. The stuffed rabbit held tightly against her chest. "I will protect you," he murmured. "I promise." Closing the door, he returned to the living room, where Roger was methodically organizing the evidence on his laptop. "I want you to prioritize locating them," Edward instructed. "Christina and Diana. If they're still in the country, they can't escape." That's when they heard a strange noise from the front door, a metallic click. Roger stood up quickly, signaling for them to be silent. He looked through the peephole and his body tensed. "There's someone in the hall," he whispered. Crouching, messing with the lock, Edward felt his blood run cold. Without making a sound, he walked to the bedroom and scooped Julia into his arms, trying not to wake her. Roger had drawn a gun and pointed to a camouflaged emergency exit in the bedroom wall. They had to wake Julia, who asked no questions when Nora explained they had to play hide-and-seek again. They heard a crash, the door being broken down. They descended the service stairs as quietly as possible. On the third landing, they heard voices above them and the sound of footsteps. "They followed us," Nora whispered. Edward opened a maintenance door, revealing a dimly lit service corridor. They moved quickly until they found another staircase that led them to the car park. Marcia's grey sedan was waiting for them near the exit. They got in hurriedly, and she sped off, disappearing into London's night traffic. "Roger?" Marcia asked. He stayed behind, a distraction, Edward replied. How did they find us so quickly? Nora asked, still trembling. The old phones, Edward realized. They might have activated remote trackers. The new safe house was an isolated cottage on the outskirts of London. Roger reached them the next morning with important news. We've identified fake identity documents created within Mendoza Tech for Christina and Diana, and more. Reservations in those names for a flight leaving Gatwick Airport tonight at 11:45 p.m. to Madrid. We need to intercept them, Edward said. It's already being arranged. My contact at the NCA, Detective Santos, is organizing an operation. During the day, agents position themselves discreetly at the airport. Edward wanted to be there in person, but Nora convinced him to stay. Julia needs you alive, she said simply, words that changed Edward's perspective. That night, they followed the operation through radio updates. Targets identified at check-in, passing through passport control. Approach initiated. Suspects in custody. Operation successful. Edward felt something break inside him. A tension he had been carrying for days, perhaps years. Silent tears streamed down his face. Nora squeezed his hand. It's over, she whispered. A week later, Edward entered an interrogation room at the NCA headquarters. Christina was sitting on the other side of the table, handcuffed, her hair dyed blonde, her face thinner, her eyes hard. 5 minutes, said the guard, closing the door. The silence hung heavy between them. Finally, Christina spoke. Come for your revenge. I came for an explanation, Edward replied. How could you do it? They were our daughters. A muscle twitched in her face. I never wanted them to die, she said, looking away. It was only ever supposed to be you, your empire, your fortune. But they were in the car, and you knew. You gave the order anyway. Christina lifted her chin, defiant. What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry, it wouldn't change anything. And Julia, Edward asked, why hide my daughter from me? Diana was always obsessed with you. When she found out she was pregnant, she needed money. I needed access to Mendoza Tech. It was a convenient arrangement. Edward felt sick thinking of Diana using a child, his child, as a pawn in a twisted game. You're going to spend the rest of your life in prison, he said calmly. And while you do, I'm going to raise Julia. I'm going to give her the love you and Diana denied her. Christina's mask momentarily cracked. The girls liked her, she said, almost a whisper. Especially Beatrice. From the first moment, it was as if she knew they were sisters. That's why they had to die, Edward completed, because Beatrice found out the truth. Christina didn't answer, but her eyes for the first time were full of unshed tears. The guard opened the door. Time was up. Edward stood, looking one last time at the woman who had destroyed his family. Goodbye, Christina. The only legacy you left is Julia, and even that wasn't by your choice. He walked out without looking back, feeling strangely light. It wasn't forgiveness. It never would be, but it was release. 2 months later, Highgate Cemetery was peaceful under the afternoon sun. Edward walked slowly, holding Julia's hand. Nora followed them, carrying flowers. They stopped before the Triplets' grave, which had been modified. In addition to the original names, there was an additional plaque, Sisters Eternal, Forever Loved. Julia let go of Edward's hand and knelt before the headstone, carefully placing the flowers. Hi, girls, she said naturally. I brought daisies today. Daddy said you liked them. Edward felt his heart ache hearing Julia call him Daddy. In the weeks following the conspirators' arrest, many things had changed. With the help of a psychologist, Edward had told Julia the truth in a way appropriate for her age. He explained that he was her biological father, that Helen had raised her with genuine love, and that the friends from the cemetery were her half-sisters. The girl had reacted with a mixture of confusion, sadness, and surprisingly relief. I knew we looked alike, she had said, studying Edward's face. We have the same way of frowning. The arrangement Edward had promised Nora became a reality, a house in Hampstead where Julia had her own colourful bedroom, and Nora remained present, a bridge between the girl's past and her new present. The millions recovered from the offshore accounts were directed to a foundation in the Triplets' name, dedicated to helping orphaned children. Can they hear me? Julia asked, looking up at the sky. I think so, Edward replied. And they're happy that we're together now. Like a family, Julia completed simply. Yes, Edward agreed, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. Like a family. As they walked back, Julia between Edward and Nora, the businessman thought about how life could be both cruel and generous. 3 parts of his heart would always be missing, but an unexpected part had been found. "Daddy," Julia called, pulling his hand. "Are we still going to make those rabbit-shaped pancakes you promised?" Edward smiled, feeling something warm expand in his chest. "Hope. Of course we are. As soon as we get home." Looking one last time at the cemetery, Edward could have sworn he saw 3 youthful silhouettes smiling among the tombstones. Just a trick of the light, probably. The wind gently rustled the trees, like a whisper of approval. And for anyone paying close attention, they might have heard the distant echo of 3 identical laughs, blessing a family that, though broken and mended, had found its way back to the light.